What if the most powerful truths are hidden in stories never fully told? Unfinished Tales pulls readers into Middle-earth's shadows, where broken histories, lost voices, and incomplete legends reveal deeper meanings about leadership, fate, courage, and responsibility, proving that what remains unfinished often shapes the world more than what is complete. Enjoyed the video? Subscribe to our channel, heave it I like, share it with friends, and leave a comment. Don't forget to hit the bell icon for all updates. Chapter 1. Shadows of Forgotten Histories. What if the most powerful truths are hidden in stories never fully told? In Unfinished Tales, J.R.R. Tolkien presents a world where the gaps, the fragments, and the unfinished threads reveal more than a completed narrative ever could. From the earliest ages of Middle-earth to the shadowed corners of Númenor, these incomplete accounts allow readers to peer into the very mechanics of fate, choice, and consequence. It is within these unpolished stories that the depth of Tolkien's imagination shines brightest, illustrating that history itself is rarely neat or complete. Middle-earth is often remembered through the lens of epic narratives: the fall of Sauron, the journey of the Fellowship, the great battles of elves and men. But these stories are only the surface. Beneath them lies a tapestry woven with unfinished events, aborted quests, and the fleeting lives of heroes whose tales were never fully recorded. A fragment, each incomplete tale, serves as a window into the complex web of cause and effect that defines Tolkien's world. In many ways, these unfinished stories mirror our own understanding of history. Real history is never perfectly preserved. It is always mediated by perspective, loss, and interpretation. Tolkien understood this, and Unfinished Tales is his deliberate exploration of the incomplete. One of the earliest threads in these tales concerns Númenor, the island kingdom of men who were granted great knowledge and longevity by the Valar. The rise and fall of Númenor is presented in fragments, showing the kingdom at its height and the seeds of its eventual doom. Through these incomplete accounts, Tolkien emphasizes that even the greatest civilizations are fragile when hubris and desire eclipse wisdom. The kings of Númenor, once wise and just, gradually succumbed to arrogance, driven by the fear of death and the allure of forbidden knowledge. The fragments illustrate not only the events, but the moral decay that accompanies unchecked power. By leaving gaps in the narrative, Tolkien allows readers to reflect on the underlying causes of Númenor's fall, rather than simply witnessing its destruction. The unfinished nature of the story mirrors the unpredictable consequences of human ambition, a subtle reminder that history is shaped as much by what is omitted or misunderstood as by what is recorded. The narratives surrounding individual characters are equally revealing. Consider the early life of Gandalf, whose origins and missions are only partially documented. In Unfinished Tales, glimpses of Gandalf's travels, his counsel to kings and heroes, and his quiet interventions in pivotal events show a figure who operates behind the scenes, shaping the course of history without demanding recognition. These fragments emphasize that influence is not always visible, and that leadership often exists in the unseen, subtle decisions of those who guide others wisely. Gandalf's story demonstrates how the incomplete, the partially understood, and the overlooked can wield immense power, reminding readers that what is left unsaid may carry as much weight as the spoken word. Another significant narrative concerns the tragic figure of Túrin. Unlike the clean arcs of completed tales, Túrin's story is intentionally fragmented, reflecting the chaos and inevitability of fate. His pride, stubbornness, and tragic choices are chronicled in pieces that force readers to assemble the story themselves. In doing so, Tolkien immerses the reader in the very experience of tragedy, uncertainty, the missteps, and the moments of unrecorded consequence that shape destiny. The story of Túrin exemplifies how incomplete narratives can deepen emotional engagement, requiring readers to confront the ambiguity of life, the randomness of suffering, and the weight of personal responsibility. By presenting Túrin's life in fragments, Tolkien emphasizes that heroism and failure are rarely absolute. They exist within a continuum of choices and consequences that are often only partially visible to the historian or reader. The collection also explores the shadowed forces of Middle-earth, particularly the Nazgul, whose origins and rise are only partially detailed. These dark figures illustrate the seductive power of ambition and the corrosive effect of corruption over time. The fragments describing the rings of power and the ensnaring of the kings of men provide insight into the slow, almost imperceptible process by which evil can infiltrate even the noblest hearts. By leaving gaps in the narrative, Tolkien invites the reader to consider the psychological and moral dynamics at play, rather than focusing solely on climactic battles or dramatic confrontations. The unfinished nature of the tale mirrors the gradual, insidious rise of corruption itself, emphasizing that evil often works in silence and shadows, just as these tales do, reflecting the long perspective of immortal beings and the slow erosion of memory over ages. Tales of lost realms, forgotten wars, and the beauty that endures, despite time's ravages, provide a counterpoint to the human experiences of ambition, pride, and downfall. Through these elvish fragments, Tolkien explores the themes of memory, loss, and preservation. The incomplete stories highlight that even immortals cannot fully control history or memory, and that what is preserved is often selective, leaving gaps that future generations must interpret. In this way, the unfinished elvish accounts mirror the human task of understanding the past, always partial, always mediated, and never fully complete. Throughout Unfinished Tales, the reader encounters a consistent interplay between what is recorded and what is left untold. History, whether in Middle-earth or in our own world, is rarely linear or complete. It is a collection of perspectives, fragmentary records, and lost knowledge. By presenting stories that are unfinished, Tolkien invites the reader to engage actively with the text, to imagine the unseen, and to reflect on the consequences of choices that may never have been fully documented. This interaction deepens engagement and underscores the central lesson of these tales, that the unknown, the unrecorded, and the unfinished are often as significant as the documented events themselves. The structure of Unfinished Tales also emphasizes connectivity across time and space. Characters and events from different ages intersect, influence one another, and ripple through history, even when the connections are only partially revealed. The rise of Númenor affects the later histories of Middle. These incomplete narratives demonstrate that history is not a collection of isolated incidents, but a network of interconnected actions, intentions, and consequences. The unfinished nature of the tales forces the reader to recognize these connections, and consider how even minor or unnoticed actions can reverberate through time. The language and tone of the fragments contribute to their power, capable of conveying vast historical sweeps while attending to individual emotion and choice. The incompleteness is never a flaw, but a deliberate stylistic choice that mirrors the content. History itself is incomplete. This creates a reading experience that is immersive, reflective, and intellectually stimulating, reconstructing histories, interpreting motives, and imagining outcomes. Unfinished Tales reminds us that life and history are never complete, that our actions are recorded partially, and that understanding requires engagement, interpretation, and imagination. The unfinished fragments of Middle-earth challenge us to consider our own histories, and to understand that what is left unsaid can be as meaningful as what is explicitly recorded. Through the incomplete stories of Númenor, Gandalf, Túrin, and the elves, Tolkien teaches that meaning is often found in fragments, that legacy is built through choices seen and unseen, and that the unfinished can reveal truths that the complete cannot. In conclusion, Chapter 1 of Unfinished Tales establishes the central theme of incompleteness as both a narrative strategy and a philosophical reflection. Through fragmented histories, untold stories, and incomplete accounts of heroes and civilizations, the unfinished nature of these tales invites active engagement, reflection, and imagination, making the reader a participant in reconstructing history rather than a mere observer. By presenting narratives that are intentionally incomplete, Tolkien emphasizes that the gaps, shadows, and silences of history are not deficiencies, but sources of insight, mystery, and profound understanding, demonstrating that the stories we never fully know can teach us as much, if not more, than those we do. Chapter 2. The Rise and Fall of Númenor. Power is a gift that often comes with peril, and few examples illustrate this better than the story of Númenor. In Unfinished Tales, Tolkien presents the fragments of this legendary island kingdom, offering glimpses of its glory and its inevitable decline. These tales are incomplete, yet within their gaps lies a profound lesson. Greatness is fragile, and pride can undo even the wisest of civilizations. The story of Númenor is not merely historical. It is moral, philosophical, and timeless, resonating far beyond the confines of myth. Númenor was a land of extraordinary beauty and innovation. Blessed by the Valar, its people were taller, wiser, and longer lived than ordinary men. The kingdom was an unparalleled blend of art, knowledge, and power, where cities gleamed with architectural mastery and seafaring skills surpassed those of any neighboring lands. Yet, even at its height, Númenor's greatness was inseparable from the shadow of mortality. The kings of Númenor, aware of their inevitable deaths, became obsessed with extending life and avoiding the fate that all men must face. This fear of mortality planted the seeds of hubris, which would later blossom into tragic arrogance. The fragments in unfinished tales allow readers to witness the slow erosion of wisdom under the weight of desire, illustrating that the greatest gifts can become sources of temptation and downfall. The early Númenorians were humble and faithful to the guidance of the Valar, honoring their blessings and using their gifts responsibly. Their expansion across the seas was driven by curiosity, exploration, and the noble desire to understand the world. The fragments of their voyages suggest a civilization eager to learn and to connect with distant lands, yet cautious and wise in its dealings. However, over generations, the caution that once defined Númenor began to erode. Kings grew ambitious, and the fear of death, coupled with the desire for absolute power, led to the gradual corruption of the royal line. These incomplete narratives convey moral and historical truths. The erosion of virtue is often imperceptible, and the decay of wisdom occurs gradually, hidden behind prosperity and achievement. One of the most compelling aspects of Númenor's story in Unfinished Tales is the way Tolkien presents the moral struggle of its rulers. The fragments depict kings torn between respect for the Valar and the temptation of dominion over life and death itself. Some, like Silmarillion, are celebrated for their skill and vision, while others, such as Ar. By presenting these figures in partial accounts, Tolkien avoids simplistic characterizations. Number king is wholly good or evil. Instead, readers are invited to explore the complexity of leadership, ambition, and moral responsibility. These unfinished stories reflect the unpredictable nature of power and the subtlety with which corruption can spread, echoing lessons that are as relevant in our world as they are in Middle. The fragments also reveal the broader social and cultural consequences of Númenor's decline. As kings pursued immortality and dominion, the people of the island became divided. Faith in the Valar waned, and devotion to the dark lure of Morgoth's influence embodied in the incomplete narratives describe secret cults, whispered seditions, and growing unrest among the populace. Though these accounts are fragmented, they suggest that societal collapse is not a sudden event, but a gradual unraveling, where fear, envy, and ambition quietly corrode shared values. Tolkien's choice to leave these histories unfinished underscores the unpredictability of such decline. Not every detail is known, and much is left to the imagination, emphasizing that the consequences of moral failure extend far beyond the actions of rulers alone. A key element of Númenor's story is the tension between mortality and ambition. The desire to escape death so natural to humans becomes a central theme, motivating kings and shaping history. This preoccupation with life's limits mirrors the human condition, reinforcing Tolkien's enduring relevance. Through the fragments, readers witness not only the events themselves, but the internal conflicts that drive them. The narrative shows how fear can be as powerful as desire, and how moral compromise often begins with seemingly small concessions, eventually culminating in disaster. The incomplete nature of these tales invites reflection, compelling readers to consider how they themselves might respond to power, fear, and temptation. The downfall of Númenor is depicted as both catastrophic and inevitable. Ar Farasin, defiance of the Valar, and his attempt to conquer Emunda undying Landstrigard, the divine response that sank the island beneath the sea. Yet Tolkien's fragments do more than recount catastrophe. They examine the human experience of pride, error, and consequence. The incompleteness of the tales mirrors the chaos and uncertainty of disaster itself. As events unfold in ways that cannot be fully predicted or controlled, readers are left to grapple with questions of fate versus choice, learning that even great civilizations are vulnerable to their own flaws. The moral resonance of these fragments lies in their ambiguity. History is rarely simple, and the forces that shape it are complex, intertwined, and often unfinished. The fragments also provide insight into the survivors and their legacy. Not all Númenorians perished. A faithful few escaped to where they became the ancestors of the Dúnedain, and eventually established kingdoms such as Arnor and Gon. These survivors carried with them the wisdom and mistakes of their homeland, and through their stories, the lessons of Númenor were transmitted to future generations. The unfinished nature of these accounts allows Tolkien to suggest continuity without closure. History moves forward, shaped by memory, adaptation, and survival. This emphasis on continuity and the persistence of culture demonstrates Tolkien's understanding of history as a living process, one that is always influenced by both triumph and tragedy. The narrative style of the Númenor fragments is particularly significant. Tolkien employs a tone that is simultaneously mythic and reflective, blending historical record with moral inquiry. The language evokes grandeur while maintaining intimacy, allowing readers to experience the personal stakes behind political and cosmic events. The incomplete form reinforces the themes of mystery, impermanence, and moral complexity. By leaving parts of the story untold, Tolkien encourages readers to fill in the gaps, fostering engagement and reflection. This participatory aspect of reading mirrors the act of understanding history itself. One must interpret incomplete records, consider multiple perspectives, and draw lessons from fragments. Another important aspect of these tales is the ethical dimension embedded within Númenor's history. Leadership is presented as a test of character, wisdom, and foresight. The fragments illustrate that authority alone is insufficient. Moral integrity and humility are essential to sustain a society. Artafarzan's failure contrasts sharply with earlier kings who respected the guidance of the Valar, highlighting the interplay between personal virtue and societal stability. Through these fragments, Tolkien presents a nuanced exploration of leadership. Power without principle is destructive, while humility and prudence enable continuity and resilience. The unfinished nature of the narratives amplifies this lesson, as readers must wrestle with the complexities of moral choice without the comfort of a neatly resolved plot. The story of Númenor also emphasizes the role of foresight and counsel. Figures like Elendil, who escaped the fall of Númenor, embody the value of wisdom, preparation, and moral courage. Their survival ensured the preservation of Númenorian knowledge and culture. These fragments suggest that while history may be shaped by catastrophe, individual choices can mitigate loss and transmit lessons to future generations. The incompleteness of the narrative mirrors the uncertainty faced by those who attempt to act wisely in a complex and dangerous world, reinforcing the theme that even partial knowledge can guide meaningful action. Finally, the fragments of Númenor remind readers that history, culture, and morality are intertwined. The rise and fall of the Island Kingdom illustrates the delicate balance between ambition and restraint, knowledge and humility, power and responsibility. Tolkien's unfinished narratives emphasize that greatness is never permanent, and that the lessons of the past are preserved, not through perfection but through reflection on what went wrong. The gaps in the story serve as invitations to engage, interpret, and learn. By exploring the incomplete history of Númenor, readers gain insight into the fragility of civilizations, the complexity of human nature, and the enduring relevance of moral and ethical choice. In conclusion, Chapter 2 of Unfinished Tales examines the rise and fall of Númenor through fragmented narratives that illuminate the dangers of pride, ambition, and moral compromise. The incomplete accounts allow readers to engage with history actively, reflecting on the causes and consequences of human error. By presenting Númenor's story in fragments, Tolkien underscores the unpredictability of history, the moral complexity of leadership, and the enduring lessons of survival and legacy. The rise and fall of Númenor is a cautionary tale that resonates across time, demonstrating that the unfinished stories of the past carry profound truths for the present and the future. Chapter 3. The Burden of Leadership and Fate. What does it truly mean to lead when every choice carries weight beyond comprehension? In the fragmented narratives of unfinished tales, leadership is rarely straightforward. Tolkien presents leaders of Middle-earth as figures shaped by circumstance, moral complexity, and the unseen consequences of their actions. The fragments reveal that leadership is not merely the exercise of authority, but the continuous negotiation between personal desire, ethical responsibility, and the unpredictable forces of fate. This chapter examines how the incomplete accounts of leadership reveal the profound burdens that define both individuals and civilizations. In Middle-earth, leadership is often inseparable from moral integrity. The Númenorians, as seen in Chapter 2, exemplify the dangers of power divorced from principle. But beyond Númenor, leaders like Elendil and later Gondorian kings demonstrate the fragile balance between ambition and duty. The fragments in Unfinished Tales highlight that leadership is rarely about conquest or glory. It is about vision, wisdom, and the ability to act decisively under uncertainty. Tolkien's incomplete records leave gaps precisely to illustrate the complexity of leaders are forced to navigate imperfect knowledge, partial histories, and conflicting moral imperatives, which mirrors the human condition itself. Choices are rarely clear, and consequences often extend far beyond what can be foreseen. One of the central lessons from these fragments is the relationship between leadership and fate. Tolkien repeatedly emphasizes that even the greatest leaders are not free from the currents of destiny. The lives of kings and heroes are intertwined with events beyond their control, and their decisions are shaped as much by circumstance as by personal will. Yet, within these constraints, leadership demands courage. Elendil, who survived Númenor's destruction, became a symbol of resilience. Leading the faithful to new lands and establishing kingdoms in Middle illustrates that leadership is defined not solely by victories, but by the perseverance and wisdom applied amid chaos. The unfinished nature of the narrative mirrors the uncertainties inherent in leadership itself. The outcomes of decisions can never be fully known, and history often remembers only the consequences, not the deliberations or struggles that produced them. The burden of leadership is further complicated by the moral weight of choice. Leaders in Middle-earth must balance personal ambition with the needs of their people, and their decisions often carry irreversible consequences. Consider Isildur's fateful choice to claim the One Ring rather than destroy it. The fragments reveal a profound lesson. Moral failure at the moment of greatest responsibility can ripple through generations, leaving long shadows over both the individual and the society they serve. Tolkien's unfinished accounts emphasize that the true test of leadership is not the accumulation of power, but the ethical exercise of authority. Decisions are rarely simple, and even well-intentioned leaders can falter, reminding readers that leadership carries both privilege and profound responsibility. The incomplete nature of these tales allows readers to experience the uncertainty that leaders themselves faced. Unlike traditional narratives, where the story concludes neatly, Unfinished Tales leaves critical moments unresolved, mirroring the ambiguity inherent in governing and decision. Leaders often act without full knowledge, personal biases, and the unpredictable actions of others. Tolkien conveys the weight of responsibility in its most authentic form, as an ongoing negotiation between idealism, practicality, and moral judgment. This narrative strategy engages the reader, forcing them to consider what they might do in similar circumstances, and highlighting the timeless relevance of Tolkien's work. Leadership in Middle-earth is also intimately connected to service and sacrifice. The fragments repeatedly show that true leaders act not for personal gain but for the well-being of their people. Figures like Elendil and Aragorn, though separated by generations, embody the principle that authority is not entitlement, but duty. They lead through example, counsel, and courage, often at great personal cost. The incomplete accounts of their deeds, victories, and failures illustrate that the value of leadership is not measured solely by outcomes, but by intent. By leaving these tales unfinished, Tolkien underscores that the measure of leadership cannot always be quantified. Its impact reverberates subtly, sometimes visible only in hindsight. A recurring theme in these fragments is the interplay between human agency and supernatural influence. Leaders in Middle-earth frequently encounter forces beyond ordinary comprehension. divine mandates, prophetic visions, and mystical threats. Gandalf's guidance, for example, is often subtle, emphasizing the importance of counsel over direct command. Leaders must interpret signs, anticipate consequences, and make choices that align with both moral principles and practical realities. These unfinished narratives show that leadership is rarely solitary. It is shaped by counsel, collaboration, and the interplay of visible and invisible forces. The fragmentary style reinforces this theme, as gaps in the story encourage readers to imagine the unseen pressures and decisions that define leadership. The tension between personal desire and collective responsibility is another key aspect of Tolkien's exploration of leadership. Kings and heroes often struggle with conflicting priorities: personal ambition, familial duty, political necessity, and moral obligation. The fragments capture moments of doubt, hesitation, and ethical struggle, illustrating that leadership is not a static role, but an ongoing moral and strategic challenge. By leaving elements unresolved, Tolkien allows readers to witness the internal conflicts of leaders, emphasizing that greatness is not the absence of doubt, but the ability to act responsibly despite it. These lessons are not confined to They resonate in real-world contexts where decision-making is complex, high-stakes, and morally fraught. The narratives also explore the consequences of failure in leadership. Decisions that neglect wisdom, justice, or foresight often have repercussions extending far beyond immediate outcomes. Ar-Pharazôn's hubris in Númenor, Isildur's claim of the One Ring, and other instances of flawed judgment illustrate that leadership mistakes are rarely isolated. They shape history, culture, and the destinies of entire peoples. Tolkien's fragmented accounts allow readers to reflect on the long-term consequences of actions, showing that leadership is both a privilege and a burden, with moral and historical significance. The unfinished nature of the tales encourages contemplation, and reinforcing the lesson that ethical leadership is both challenging and vital. Connectivity among leaders across generations is another striking feature of unfinished tales. Decisions made by one ruler affect the fates of others centuries later, illustrating a continuous chain of influence, while Aragorn's later actions fulfill ancient legacies. By presenting these interconnected fragments, Tolkien emphasizes the cumulative effect of leadership. No decision exists in isolation. The narrative encourages readers to perceive history as a network of actions, consequences, and moral responsibilities, rather than as a series of discrete events. This approach deepens the thematic resonance of leadership, highlighting that foresight, prudence, and ethical clarity are essential not only for immediate outcomes, but for shaping the course of future generations. The chapter also examines the role of humility in leadership. Leaders who recognize the limits of their knowledge, the inevitability of fate, and the necessity of counsel often achieve the greatest outcomes. Gandalf's subtle guidance, Elendil's measured wisdom, and Aragorn's cautious diplomacy all demonstrate that leadership is less about commanding obedience than about enabling others, making informed decisions, and acting with moral integrity. Tolkien's incomplete narratives capture these dynamics, showing that leadership is not a simple accumulation of power, but a complex interplay of responsibility, foresight, and ethical judgment. Finally, Chapter 3 emphasizes that leadership is inseparable from legacy. Leaders are remembered not only for their victories, but for the values they embody and the choices they make under pressure. The fragmentary nature of Tolkien's tales mirrors the reality of legacy. History often records only fragments of lives, and the lessons of leadership are transmitted partially through example, myth, and memory. By leaving the stories unfinished, Tolkien allows readers to engage actively with the narratives, reconstruct moral lessons. The incomplete accounts encourage readers to imagine the weight of responsibility borne by leaders and the profound consequences of their actions across time and space. In conclusion, Chapter 3 of Unfinished Tales explores the burden of leadership and the interplay between human choice and fate. Through fragmented narratives, Tolkien shows that leadership is defined by moral integrity, courage, foresight, and humility. Leaders must navigate incomplete information, unseen pressures, and ethical dilemmas, while understanding that their actions have far-reaching consequences. the unfinished stories, encourage readers to reflect on the complexity of authority, the weight of responsibility, and the moral challenges inherent in guiding others. By examining leadership in its most nuanced and fragmentary form, Tolkien demonstrates that true greatness lies not in power or recognition but in wisdom, ethical clarity, and the ability to act responsibly amid uncertainty. Chapter 4. Gandalf Quiet, Wisdom. Leadership is not always measured by the loudest voice or the most visible action. Often, it is the quiet guidance that shapes history most profoundly. In Unfinished Tales, Tolkien presents Gandalf as a figure whose wisdom and subtle influence extend far beyond his appearances. Though his deeds are partially recorded and many of his interventions remain untold, the fragments collectively reveal the remarkable power of insight, foresight, and moral courage. This chapter explores Gandalf's quiet wisdom, illustrating how invisible leadership, careful counsel, and ethical guidance can alter the course of events in Middle-earth. Gandalf is not a king, a warrior, or a ruler, yet his impact on Middle-earth rivals that of any sovereign. The fragments in Unfinished Tales demonstrate that influence is not synonymous with authority. Gandalf operates behind the scenes, shaping decisions, guiding heroes, and preserving the balance between good and evil. His interventions are often subtle, appearing as suggestions, advice, or gentle nudges, rather than overt commands. By presenting Gandalf's actions in incomplete accounts, Tolkien emphasizes that the most significant leadership can be unobtrusive. The quiet, almost invisible work of guidance often determines outcomes as profoundly as direct action, highlighting the moral and strategic dimensions of true wisdom. One of the earliest glimpses of Gandalf's influence in the fragments relates to Númenor's decline and its survivors. Gandalf counsels Elendil and other faithful Númenor, guiding them towards safety and the preservation of knowledge. These interventions, though incompletely documented, illustrate the delicate balance between foresight and action. Gandalf recognizes that history cannot be rewritten, yet he understands the responsibility of ensuring that wisdom and moral principles survive catastrophic events. His guidance is strategic and ethical, emphasizing prevention, foresight, and the moral use of knowledge. The incomplete accounts invite readers to imagine the complexity of these decisions and the careful thought required to balance risk, ethics, and long-term consequences. Another key aspect of Gandalf's wisdom is his understanding of human and elvish nature. He is attuned to the strengths, weaknesses, and moral dilemmas of those he guides. For example, his interactions with Aragorn and other members of the Fellowship demonstrate that effective leadership involves recognizing individual potential while allowing free will. Gandalf does not coerce. He advises, encourages, and sometimes intervenes subtly. The fragments highlight that true guidance respects the autonomy of others while steering them toward morally sound choices. This nuanced approach reflects Tolkien's belief that leadership is as much about enabling others as it is about achieving specific outcomes. Gandalf's quiet wisdom is a study in the ethical exercise of influence, showing that guidance is often most effective when it is unobtrusive and patient. Gandalf's interventions also reveal a deep understanding of the broader forces shaping Middle-earth. He perceives the interplay of fate, prophecy, and individual choice, and he acts in ways that align with both ethical principles and practical strategy. For instance, his advice to Númenorians and his guidance of the Fellowship show his awareness that events are interconnected and that seemingly minor actions can have far-reaching consequences. The incomplete records of these interventions reinforce the theme of subtle influence. Much of Gandalf's work is unrecorded, invisible to those who only observe outcomes. This narrative strategy encourages readers to appreciate the unseen forces that shape history and the value of wisdom applied with patience and foresight. The fragments also emphasize Gandalf's moral clarity. Unlike many leaders in Middle-earth, whose decisions are complicated by pride, ambition, or fear, Gandalf acts consistently in alignment with ethical principles. His guidance seeks to protect life, preserve knowledge, and resist corruption. This unwavering moral compass enables him to act decisively when necessary and to offer counsel that is both practical and ethically sound. By presenting his story in fragments, Tolkien illustrates that the exercise of moral wisdom is rarely linear. It involves judgment, interpretation, and responsiveness to evolving circumstances. The incomplete accounts mirror the complexity of ethical decision-making in leadership, where outcomes are uncertain and information is always partial. Gandalf's quiet wisdom is further illustrated by his understanding of timing. He recognizes that action must often be delayed, counsel must be carefully delivered, and influence must be applied strategically. In many cases, he allows others to make their own choices, intervening only when necessary to prevent catastrophe or to reinforce ethical principles. These fragments highlight the subtle art of leadership, knowing when to act, when to observe, and when to guide indirectly. Gandalf's approach reflects a profound understanding of human nature, organizational dynamics, and the moral responsibilities inherent in influence. By leaving these narratives incomplete, Tolkien underscores that leadership involves judgment, patience, and foresight, qualities that are often invisible but profoundly impactful. Another important dimension of Gandalf's role is his ability to inspire trust and collaboration. He brings together diverse groupsmen, elves, dwarves, and hobbits, encouraging cooperation and mutual respect. The fragments suggest that Gandalf's presence fosters unity and shared purpose, demonstrating that leadership is not merely about directing action but about creating environments where collective strengths can flourish. By emphasizing these qualities through unfinished accounts, Tolkien conveys that effective leadership depends on character, ethical influence, and the cultivation of trust rather than coercion or fear. Gandalf's quiet wisdom embodies the principle that moral authority and personal integrity are as critical as strategic insight in shaping outcomes. The incompleteness of Gandalf's recorded actions also mirrors the uncertainty inherent in guiding history. Leaders rarely possess complete information. They must act amidst ambiguity, interpret complex circumstances, and anticipate potential consequences. Gandalf's decisions are presented in fragments, precisely to illustrate this reality. Readers are invited to imagine the considerations, risks, and judgments involved, highlighting the cognitive and ethical dimensions of leadership. This narrative approach enhances engagement, encourages reflection, and reinforces the theme that wisdom is exercised most effectively when it is thoughtful, deliberate, and responsive to context. Gandalf's wisdom is inseparable from his humility. Unlike the kings and rulers of Númenor, he does not seek glory, dominion, or recognition. His influence is measured by outcomes, ethical clarity, and the preservation of moral and cultural values. The fragments emphasize that true leadership does not require visible authority. It is grounded in knowledge, judgment, and a commitment to the greater good. This perspective contrasts sharply with figures driven by ambition or pride, reinforcing the central lesson that leadership is most effective when it is exercised ethically, invisibly, and with humility. The fragments also demonstrate Gandalf's strategic foresight. He anticipates threats, understands the interplay of political and moral forces, and positions allies to act effectively. His subtle interventions shape outcomes without dominating events, showing that influence often lies in preparation, guidance, and the ethical deployment of knowledge rather than in direct control. Tolkien's choice to present these narratives in fragments mirrors the uncertainty and complexity of real-world decision-making, highlighting that leadership is rarely simple, and that subtlety, patience, and judgment are essential. Finally, Gandalf's quiet wisdom illustrates the enduring importance of moral courage, acting ethically, guiding others, and making decisions under uncertainty requires resilience, judgment, and inner strength. The fragments reveal that leadership is a continuous moral and strategic exercise, where patience, foresight, and humility often matter more than heroic feats or dramatic victories. By leaving much of Gandalf's work untold, Tolkien empathizes the subtle, often invisible labor that underpins history and the profound impact of ethical guidance. In conclusion, Chapter 4 of Unfinished Tales explores Gandalf's quiet wisdom as a model of leadership defined by subtle influence, moral clarity, foresight, and humility. The fragmented accounts emphasize that true leadership is rarely visible, often operating behind the scenes, and grounded in ethical principles rather than authority or recognition. Through Gandalf, Tolkien demonstrates that guidance, counsel, and moral courage are as impactful as decisive action, and that the most enduring influence often arises from the unseen. The unfinished narratives invite readers to reflect on the nature of leadership, the exercise of wisdom, and the ethical responsibilities inherent in shaping history. Gandalf's story reminds us that quiet, principled guidance can alter the course of events as profoundly as grand gestures or heroic battles, and that the unseen labor of leaders often determines the fate of civilizations. Chapter 5. The Tragedy of Túrin Turambar. What happens when pride, fate, and circumstance converge to shape a life beyond repair, whose story is intentionally fragmented to reflect the chaos and inevitability of destiny? Unlike neat narratives of heroism, Trin-esque life is marked by misfortune, misunderstanding, and moral ambiguity, emphasizing that heroism and failure often coexist. Chapter 5 explores the lessons of Trin-esque story. Trin-esque tale begins with promise, yet from the outset, his life is overshadowed by doom. It interacts with personal pride, stubbornness, and the flaws inherent in human character. And moral responsibility cannot be separated from circumstance, where events rarely unfold in a clear or linear manner, which repeatedly leads him into conflict and misunderstanding. For example, Trin often refuses counsel, dismisses warnings, and acts impulsively in pursuit of his own ideals of courage and justice. These actions, though understandable in context, illustrating that personal pride can magnify the challenges imposed by fate. Tolkien's fragmented narrative style reinforces the moral complexity of these events, showing that heroism is rarely unambiguous, and that noble intentions can yield disastrous outcomes. The interplay between fate and personal choice is central to Trin-esque story. Throughout the fragments, readers encounter situations where his decisions directly influence the unfolding of events. Yet these choices are constrained by forces beyond his control. His life is a delicate balance between agency and inevitability, demonstrating Tolkien's recurring theme that even the most heroic individuals are subject to circumstances they cannot fully master. By presenting Trin-esque life in incomplete accounts, Tolkien encourages readers to reflect on the consequences of decisions made under pressure, emphasizing that leadership, courage, and morality are inseparable from the context in which they are exercised. One of the most striking elements of Trin-esque story is the isolation he experiences. Unlike Gandalf or Elendil, who operate within networks of counsel and collaboration, Trin often faces challenges alone. His solitude intensifies the consequences of his choices, as there are few voices to counterbalance pride, misunderstanding, or impulsive action. The fragments reveal how isolation can exacerbate human weaknesses, creating conditions where fate and personal flaws intersect destructively. Tolkien's incomplete narrative style mirrors this isolation. Gaps in the story highlight both the limits of human understanding and the profound impact of individual action in shaping outcomes. The fragments also explore Trin-esque relationships with those around him. His interactions with family, friends, and allies are often fraught with misunderstanding, exacerbating the tragic trajectory of his life. Key relationships, though partially documented, reveal the moral and emotional stakes that define his character. Through these incomplete narratives, readers witness the complexity of human emotion, the consequences of miscommunication. Tolkien's approach emphasizes that tragedy is rarely simple. It emerges from the interplay of character, circumstance, and choice. Unlike the clear-cut heroes and villains found elsewhere in myth, Trin-esque life demonstrates that morality is often entangled with circumstance, pride, and misperception. His heroic deeds are marred by error, and his mistakes, though often unintended, produce suffering for others. The incomplete nature of the tale reinforces this ambiguity, highlighting that understanding history or human behavior is never straightforward. Readers must grapple with conflicting emotions: admiration for courage, sorrow for failure, and reflection on the consequences of pride. Tolkien's fragmented narrative style mirrors the complexity of moral judgment in both fiction and reality. The story of Trin also emphasizes the inevitability of suffering in a world shaped by both fate and personal action. Tragedy in Middle-earth is not merely the result of evil forces, but arises from the complex interaction of character flaws, circumstance, and external pressures. Trin's repeated misfortunes illustrate that heroism often entails sacrifice, moral struggle, and the endurance of pain. By presenting his life in fragments, Tolkien invites readers to experience the unpredictability and weight of tragedy, emphasizing that understanding, resilience, and reflection are essential to navigating both individual and societal crises. Trin's experiences underscore the importance of wisdom, counsel, and humility. Throughout the fragments, moments arise where alternative decisions or heeding advice might have altered outcomes. Yet pride and impulsiveness prevent such resolution. These gaps serve as moral and narrative tools, illustrating that leadership, bravery, and moral judgment are inseparable from self-awareness and the willingness to listen. Tolkien's deliberate incompleteness engages readers in moral reflection, asking them to consider how knowledge, humility, and prudence might change the course of events in both fiction and reality. The fragments also highlight the universality of tragic experience. Though Trin's story is set in the mythic past of Middle-earth, the emotions, dilemmas, and consequences are profoundly human. Pride, error, isolation, and moral struggle are timeless themes, and Tolkien's incomplete narrative style enhances their resonance by leaving space for reflection and interpretation. Readers are invited to grapple with ambiguity, consider alternative outcomes, and reflect on the moral lessons embedded within the fragments. In doing so, Tolkien transforms an unfinished tale into a profound exploration of human experience, demonstrating that tragedy is not confined to fiction but resonates with the lived realities of choice, consequence, and ethical responsibility. Another significant aspect of Trin's tragedy is the ripple effect of individual decisions on wider society. His mistakes do not affect him alone. They reverberate across families, communities, and even generations. These fragments illustrate the interconnectedness of actions and consequences, emphasizing that leadership, heroism, and error have far-reaching implications. By presenting these events in an unfinished form, Tolkien encourages readers to consider the full scope of moral responsibility, reflecting on how choices both large and small can shape history in ways that are unpredictable and profound. Trin's story is also a meditation on the limits of understanding. The incomplete accounts leave readers with unanswered questions, uncertain motives, and unresolved events, mirroring the way real lives are often partially understood and imperfectly recorded. Tolkien's fragmented approach highlights the complexity of human experience, showing that tragedy emerges not from simplicity, but from the intricate interplay of fate, personality, and circumstance. By leaving gaps, the narrative fosters engagement, prompting readers to fill in the blanks, reflect on causality, and consider the moral dimensions of this. Finally, the tragedy of Trin Turambar emphasizes the enduring relevance of moral reflection and the human struggle to navigate fate and responsibility. The fragmented nature of his story mirrors the unpredictability and complexity of life itself. Readers are reminded that heroism and failure coexist, that choices carry consequences beyond immediate perception, and that understanding is always partial. Tolkien's presentation of Trin as a tragic figure encourages contemplation of pride, humility, and ethical action, demonstrating that unfinished tales can illuminate truths about human nature more powerfully than completed narratives. In conclusion, Chapter 5 of Unfinished Tales explores the tragedy of Trin Turambar, emphasizing the interplay of pride, fate, personal choice, and moral responsibility. Through fragmented narratives, Tolkien illustrates that heroism is complex, consequences are far-reaching, and tragedy often arises from the intersection of character flaws and circumstance. The incomplete accounts invite readers to engage actively with the story, reflect on moral dilemmas, and consider the subtle and profound consequences of human action. Trin's tale is a meditation on the fragility of life, the weight of ethical choice, and the enduring relevance of reflection in navigating both personal and historical tragedy. The unfinished nature of the narrative transforms his life into a lesson for all readers, that the most meaningful stories are those that challenge us to think, reflect, and learn from both triumphs and failures. Chapter 6. The Unseen Battles of Minds. In the world of Unfinished Tales, Not all struggles are fought with sword or shield. Some of the most consequential battles take place in the realm of strategy, intellect, and foresight. Tolkien presents these unseen conflicts as pivotal, often determining the fate of kingdoms, armies, and heroes long before any physical confrontation occurs. Chapter 6 explores the subtle yet powerful dynamics of mental warfare, illustrating that intelligence, strategy, and ethical judgment can shape outcomes as profoundly as physical might. Through fragmented narratives, readers are invited to engage with the complexity of revealing the profound influence of unseen minds on the history of Middle. One of the clearest examples of these unseen battles is the long struggle against Sauron. Though the Dark Lord's armies and the visible threat they pose are undeniably formidable, the fragments in Unfinished Tales emphasize the equally critical conflicts that occur in planning, counsel, and strategy. Leaders, wizards, and kings must anticipate Sauron's moves, predict outcomes, and guide their followers through complex scenarios where failure could mean annihilation. These mental battles are rarely documented in complete form. Instead, the fragments suggest that success often relies on foresight, adaptability, and the subtle exertion of influence. Tolkien's deliberate incompleteness mirrors the uncertainty inherent in strategic thinking. Outcomes are never guaranteed, and decisions must be made with incomplete information. The role of counsel is central to these mental struggles. Figures like Gandalf, Elrond, and the wise Númenorians operate not as direct combatants, but as architects of strategy, shaping events through advice, foresight, and preparation. The fragments illustrate that leadership and strategy are inseparable. Even the most courageous warriors require guidance to act effectively. Gandalf's subtle interventions, for example, often prevent disaster by steering others toward choices that maximize their strengths while mitigating risk. The narrative's incomplete nature emphasizes the complexity of strategic thought, suggesting that the most effective leadership is both adaptive and anticipatory. Tolkien also highlights the importance of moral judgment within these unseen battles. Strategy and intellect alone are insufficient. Decisions must be guided by ethics and the broader consequences of action. The fragments depict moments when leaders and counselors weighed difficult choices, balancing potential gain against ethical responsibility. This moral dimension underscores a recurring theme in Unfinished Tales. Power and intelligence are most effective when aligned with virtue. The incomplete nature of these accounts allows readers to reflect on the moral dilemmas inherent in leadership, illustrating that history is shaped not only by might, but by the ethical exercise of wisdom and judgment. Another dimension of these mental struggles is the interplay between knowledge and uncertainty. Leaders must make critical decisions with partial information, often relying on intuition, experience, and counsel to navigate ambiguity. The fragments reveal that mental battles are not only about anticipating enemies, but also about understanding allies, interpreting events, and managing complex variables that influence outcomes. Tolkien's fragmented storytelling mirrors the cognitive challenge of strategic thinking. The path forward is rarely clear, and success often depends on the ability to adapt, improvise, and act decisively amid uncertainty. The unseen battles of minds are also evident in the political and diplomatic conflicts of myth. The interactions between kingdoms, alliances, and races often hinge on negotiation, persuasion, and careful planning rather than outright warfare. The fragments suggest that victories in these arenas can prevent bloodshed, stabilize regions, and ensure long-term survival. Leaders like Elendil and the faithful demonstrate the power of foresight and ethical judgment in guiding societies through perilous times. Tolkien's presentation of these incomplete narratives underscores that strategic thinking is multifaceted, encompassing not only tactical acumen, but also diplomacy, ethical reasoning, and an understanding of human and non-human nature. The narrative also emphasizes the psychological dimension of unseen battles. Leaders must contend with fear, influencing morale. The fragments illustrate that courage is not solely physical. It includes the resilience to make difficult decisions, bear responsibility, and navigate uncertainty. Tolkien's fragmented style captures the nuanced reality of these internal conflicts, showing that mental fortitude is as crucial to historical outcomes as martial prowess. Another significant aspect of these unseen battles is the interplay between destiny and strategy. While fate shapes the broader contours of history and individual minds exert influence over immediate outcomes and long-term trajectories. The fragments highlight that strategy is both art and science. It requires creativity. By presenting these narratives incompletely, decision-making, the unseen battles of minds also intersect with the theme of collaboration. Effective strategy rarely emerges from a single individual. It is often the product of consultation, debate, and collective insight. Figures like Gandalf facilitate collaboration, ensuring that the strengths of diverse individuals are coordinated toward a common goal. Furthermore, these fragments reveal that unseen battles often determine the success of visible actions. The courage of warriors in battle, the defense of cities, and the outcomes of major conflicts are frequently contingent upon decisions made in council chambers, forests, and quiet conversations. Mental struggles influence strategy, morale, and the effective use of resources. By emphasizing this, Tolkien underscores the critical importance of intellect, planning, and ethical judgment in shaping history. The incomplete accounts invite readers to consider the hidden labor, foresight, and wisdom behind the events they witness, highlighting that the most impactful battles are not always fought with weapons. The ethical implications of strategic thinking are also central to these narratives. Leaders must consider the consequences of their decisions on innocent lives, allies, and the broader moral order. The fragments demonstrate that strategy divorced from ethics can lead to catastrophic outcomes, while decisions guided by virtue and foresight can preserve societies and protect the vulnerable. This moral dimension reinforces the broader theme of unfinished tales. History is shaped not only by action, but by the ethical application of intellect, judgment, and leadership. The unfinished nature of these accounts allows readers to reflect on the consequences of choice and the interplay between intellect, morality, and circumstance. Finally, the fragments emphasize that unseen battles are ongoing. In Middle-earth, the struggle between good and evil is not confined to dramatic moments of combat. It is continuous, operating through counsel, preparation, and ethical vigilance. Leaders, heroes, and ordinary individuals all engage in these mental and moral struggles, shaping outcomes in subtle but profound ways. By leaving these narratives incomplete, Tolkien invites readers to consider the long-term effects of foresight, judgment, and ethical decision-making, highlighting the enduring importance of intelligence, collaboration, and moral courage in shaping history. Emphasizing the centrality of strategy, foresight, ethical judgment, and collaboration in shaping the history of Tolkien's incomplete accounts encourage readers to reflect on the complexity of By focusing on mental struggles, this chapter highlights that true power often lies in wisdom, subtle influence, and the careful exercise of judgment, reinforcing the idea that unseen battles are as consequential as any fought on the battlefield. Chapter 7. The burden of prophecy. How does one act when the future itself seems predetermined? In Unfinished Tales, prophecy is a pervasive, often haunting element that shapes the decisions, fears, and ambitions of Middle-earth's inhabitants. Unlike simple foreshadowing, these fragmented prophecies carry moral weight, practical implications, and psychological influence. Chapter 7 explores the burden of prophecy, examining how foreknowledge of potential outcomes intersects with free will, ethical responsibility, and the leadership of both individuals and nations. Through incomplete narratives, Tolkien presents prophecy not as certainty but as a force that tests character, judgment, and courage. From the earliest fragments, it is evident that prophecy in Middle-earth while it can guide and inspire, it can also distort judgment, heighten fear, and foster pride or despair. Númenor, for instance, is a society where knowledge of fate intertwines with ambition and dread. Prophetic warnings about the dangers of defiance and hubris were often ignored or misinterpreted, leading to moral and political catastrophe. The fragments of these narratives suggest that prophecy's power lies not merely in its content, but in the way it shapes perception and choice. Leaders, heroes, and even ordinary people must navigate the tension between inevitability and autonomy, making decisions under the shadow of a potential future that is only partially revealed. A striking example of the burden of prophecy is found in the lives of the Dúnedain and the remnants of the survivors who settled in Middle-earth carry the memory of foretold doom, shaping their decisions and governance. Prophecies remind them of mortality, responsibility, and the need for ethical leadership. At the same time, they face the challenge of distinguishing between fate that can be influenced and outcomes that are fixed. Tolkien's fragments highlight this ambiguity. Prophecy serves as both a warning and a test, requiring leaders to exercise judgment, prudence, and moral discernment. The unfinished accounts reflect the uncertainty inherent in acting on foreknowledge, emphasizing that ethical action often requires balancing caution with courage. The fragments also reveal the psychological burden of prophecy. Knowledge of potential disaster or triumph can weigh heavily on individuals, shaping their emotions, motivations, and interactions. Túrin Turambar, as examined in Chapter 5, exemplifies the tragic effects of foreknowledge intertwined with personal flaws. His awareness of doom exacerbates pride, impulsiveness, and isolation, illustrating that prophecy can magnify human weaknesses rather than simply guide action. Similarly, kings of Númenor faced the tension between divine warnings and personal desire, showing that prophecy can complicate leadership by introducing moral and strategic dilemmas. Tolkien's incomplete narratives emphasize the nuanced effects of foreknowledge, highlighting the interplay between external forces and internal character. Prophecy also shapes the exercise of leadership by emphasizing responsibility and foresight. Leaders must interpret cryptic warnings, anticipate outcomes, and act in ways that balance ethical principles with practical realities. Gandalf, Elrond, and other wise figures exemplify the careful consideration required when dealing with prophetic knowledge. The fragments suggest that leadership under prophecy demands moral courage, patience, and the ability to resist fear, pride, and temptation. Tolkien's choice to leave these narratives incomplete mirrors the uncertainty and interpretive complexity that characterizes real-world decisions, reinforcing the theme that leadership is as much about ethical discernment as it is about authority. Another dimension of prophecy in Unfinished Tales is its effect on collective behavior. Societies respond to foreknowledge in ways that influence culture, governance, and social cohesion. Númenore's decline, in part, results from misinterpreted warnings and the inability to act ethically under the weight of potential doom. Conversely, the faithful survivors of Númenor, guided by ethical interpretation of prophecy, established new kingdoms and traditions in Middle, demonstrating that understanding and responding to prophecy can preserve knowledge, culture, and moral principles. The fragmented style emphasizes the unpredictability of societal responses, encouraging reflection on how foresight, interpretation, and ethical judgment interact to shape outcomes. Prophecy's burden extends to moral responsibility. Foreknowledge can clarify consequences but also creates a duty to act wisely. Characters who ignore warnings, act impulsively, or misinterpret guidance often produce catastrophic results, while those who heed insight and exercise restraint demonstrate wisdom and ethical leadership. Tolkien's fragments highlight that prophecy is not deterministic in the simplistic sense. It is a lens through which moral and practical choices are amplified, tested, and revealed. The incomplete nature of these accounts invites readers to consider alternative actions, ethical reasoning, and the delicate balance between caution and initiative. The psychological dimension of prophecy is also connected to fear and hope. Knowledge of potential disaster can paralyze action, while glimpses of promise can inspire courage. Leaders must navigate these emotional currents, maintaining clarity and focus amid uncertainty. Gandalf, a subtle guidance, frequently helps others interpret prophecy in ways that encourage constructive action rather than despair. By presenting these narratives in fragments, Tolkien allows readers to experience the tension, uncertainty, and emotional burden of prophecy, emphasizing the interplay between foresight, character, and ethical action. Prophecy also influences interpersonal relationships. Advice, warnings, and interpretations often generate tension between allies, families, and leaders. Disagreements about the meaning of prophecies can lead to conflict, misjudgment, or Trin tragic isolation, for instance, is compounded by misinterpretations and failures of communication. The fragments highlight that prophecy is not simply a neutral truth, but a dynamic force that interacts with human pride, fear, and morality. Tolkien's incomplete approach mirrors the complexity of human interpretation, showing that foreknowledge must be carefully integrated with judgment, humility, and ethical responsibility. Another important aspect is the subtle interplay between destiny and free will. While prophecies often outline potential outcomes, the fragments emphasize that individuals still possess agency. Ethical and strategic choices influence how prophecy manifests, demonstrating that fate is not a rigid script, but a framework within which moral and practical action can alter consequences. Leaders and heroes must discern the appropriate balance between accepting inevitability and exercising free will. The unfinished narratives highlight this delicate tension, encouraging reflection on the nature of responsibility, morale, courage, and strategic insight. The fragmented presentation of prophecy also underscores the limits of understanding. Characters rarely possess complete knowledge of the future. They interpret, act, and adjust based on partial insight. This mirrors real-world decision-making under uncertainty, where incomplete information and ethical dilemmas coexist. Tolkien's style engages readers in moral reflection, asking them to consider how knowledge, prudence, and judgment can shape outcomes, and how foreknowledge imposes responsibility as much as opportunity. The narrative gaps create space for thought, analysis, and moral contemplation, making prophecy a tool for both storytelling and ethical inquiry. Finally, the burden of prophecy in Unfinished Tales emphasizes the ethical dimension of action under uncertainty. Leaders, heroes, and ordinary individuals must weigh foreknowledge against moral principles, practical constraints, and human limitations. The fragments encourage readers to recognize that prophecy, like power, is a responsibility. It demands discernment, courage, and humility. Tolkien's unfinished accounts highlight that ethical and strategic insight is essential in navigating both foreseen and unforeseen challenges, reinforcing the broader themes of leadership, responsibility, and moral reflection explored in previous chapters. In conclusion, Chapter 7 examines the burden of prophecy in emphasizing its moral, psychological, and strategic dimensions. The fragmented narratives reveal that foreknowledge is both a guide and a test, shaping choices, character, and outcomes. Tolkien presents prophecy as a complex force that interacts with free will, ethical judgment, and leadership, demonstrating that understanding and action under uncertainty require wisdom, courage, and moral clarity. By leaving these tales unfinished, Tolkien invites readers to reflect on the interplay of fate, choice, and responsibility, highlighting that the burden of prophecy is not simply in seeing the future, but in acting wisely, ethically, and courageously in response to it. Chapter 8: The Weight of Legacy. What does it mean to inherit history and responsibility simultaneously? In Unfinished Tales, Tolkien repeatedly examines the theme of legacy, showing that the decisions, virtues, and failures of one generation shape the lives of the next. Chapter 8 explores the weight of legacy, emphasizing how inheritance is both a gift and a burden, carrying moral, cultural, and political significance. Through fragmented narratives, Tolkien demonstrates that understanding and navigating legacy requires wisdom, humility, and an awareness of the interplay between past actions and future consequences. Legacy in Middle-earth is never a simple inheritance of wealth or titles. It encompasses knowledge, moral responsibility, and cultural identity. The survivors of Númenor, for instance, carry the dual burden of ancestral wisdom and the shadow of past mistakes. Elendil and his descendants are aware of the grandeur of Númenor, as well as the hubris that led to its downfall. Their leadership reflects an acute consciousness of history. They act with the knowledge that decisions can reinforce or correct ancestral mistakes. The fragments highlight the subtle pressures of legacy, illustrating that leadership involves not only guiding the present, but also shaping the moral and cultural inheritance for future generations. One of the central aspects of legacy is moral responsibility. Leaders inherit both the virtues and failings of their predecessors. The The Númenorians, who remained faithful to the Valar, exemplify this duality. They strive to uphold the ethical and spiritual principles of their civilization, while avoiding the pride and arrogance that precipitated its destruction. Tolkien's fragmented accounts underscore the delicate balance required in managing inherited responsibility. Legacy is not a static burden. It is an ongoing dialogue between past actions, current decisions, and future outcomes, requiring reflection, discernment, and ethical clarity. The weight of legacy is further complicated by the tension between expectation and autonomy. Successors often face pressure to conform to the ideals of their forebears, yet they must navigate unique challenges and circumstances. This tension is vividly illustrated in the lives of the heirs of Elendil, including Isildur and later kings of Gondor. They inherit authority, knowledge, and expectations, but must also contend with their own ambitions, moral choices, and the unpredictable forces of fate. The fragments revealed that legacy can inspire greatness or amplify flaws, highlighting that understanding history is essential to exercising wisdom and moral judgment in leadership. Cultural and ethical continuity is another dimension of legacy. Númenor's downfall serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of forgetting moral principles in the pursuit of power. The faithful survivors transmit knowledge, customs, and values to their descendants, ensuring that wisdom endures, even in exile. The fragmented nature of these narratives emphasizes the fragility of legacy. Knowledge can be lost, distorted, or misapplied, and the moral lessons of history require active interpretation and commitment. Tolkien's incomplete accounts invite readers to reflect on the responsibilities inherent in inheritance and the ongoing effort required to preserve virtue across generations. Leadership is deeply intertwined with legacy, and kings and rulers are not only accountable for present governance, but also for ensuring that future generations inherit a stable, just, and ethical society. The fragments suggest that effective leadership is forward-looking, integrating lessons from the past with practical and moral considerations in the present. Elendil, for example, embodies this principle. His guidance and decisions reflect both the memory of Númenor's grandeur and the moral imperative to avoid repeating its mistakes. By leaving these accounts unfinished, Tolkien emphasizes that legacy is a living, dynamic process, shaped continuously by choices, actions, and reflection. The personal dimension of legacy is equally significant. Heroes and leaders must grapple with their own identities within the context of inherited responsibility. Trin Turambar's story, as discussed in Chapter 5, illustrates the dangers of a legacy burdened by misfortune and misunderstanding, while Gandalf's subtle guidance highlights the possibility of influencing legacy positively through wisdom and ethical counsel. These fragmented narratives reveal that personal conduct, character, and moral choices are critical in shaping the legacy one leaves behind, underscoring the intimate connection between ethics and history. The fragments also explore the social implications of legacy. Entire communities, cultures, and civilizations are influenced by the actions and decisions of their leaders. Númenor's fall demonstrates how neglecting ethical principles in pursuit of ambition can have catastrophic consequences, while the faithful survivors' actions show how conscientious stewardship of knowledge and values can preserve societies. Tolkien's incomplete narratives encourage readers to consider the broader impact of decisions, illustrating that legacy is not only personal but collective, influencing generations far beyond the immediate actors. Another dimension is the interplay between memory and history. The fragmented style of unfinished tales mirrors the way memory shapes understanding of legacy. Some events are recorded, others forgotten, and some misinterpreted. This mirrors real-life challenges in interpreting history, where the lessons of the past must be actively understood, analyzed, and applied. Leaders and communities in Middle-earth must navigate these gaps, making choices based on partial knowledge while striving to honor the ethical and cultural lessons of their ancestors. Tolkien's use of unfinished narratives emphasizes that legacy is not fixed, but requires engagement, reflection, and deliberate action. Prophecy also intersects with legacy, for knowledge can influence how individuals and societies approach inherited responsibility, shaping decisions in ways that preserve or distort ethical and cultural values. Gandalf's guidance often integrates both the lessons of history and prophetic insight, demonstrating how awareness of potential outcomes can inform ethical decisions. The fragments highlight that legacy is not merely inherited. It is actively interpreted, shaped, and transmitted, requiring foresight, moral clarity, and courage. The narrative further emphasizes the moral weight of unfulfilled potential. Fragmentary accounts, such as those of Númenor's faithful survivors, suggest that the incomplete nature of history leaves space for reflection, moral consideration, and deliberate action. Legacy encompasses both what has been achieved and what remains unfinished, highlighting that responsibility extends beyond immediate results to include the broader arc of influence over time. Tolkien's fragmented storytelling invites readers to contemplate the ongoing effort required to shape cultural and political inheritance responsibly. The burden of legacy is not only historical, but existential. Leaders and heroes must understand that their actions contribute to a continuum of influence, extending across time and space. Every decision, ethical choice, and strategic action has consequences for future generations. The fragments underscore that understanding this weight is essential for effective leadership and moral conduct. Tolkien's incomplete narratives reinforce the idea that legacy is a dynamic interplay between past, present, and future, demanding reflection, ethical insight, and purposeful action. Finally, Chapter 8 demonstrates that the weight of legacy is inseparable from the pursuit of virtue and wisdom. Middle-earth's histories, though incomplete, emphasize that leadership, moral and ethical guidance shape the inheritance received by future generations. The fragmented accounts encourage reflection, moral discernment, and engagement with history, highlighting that legacy is both a responsibility and an opportunity. Tolkien's unfinished tales remind readers that the past is never static, the present is morally charged, and the future is shaped by choices made with awareness, foresight, and integrity. In conclusion, Chapter 8 of Unfinished Tales explores the weight of legacy, emphasizing its moral, cultural, and political dimensions. Through fragmented narratives, Tolkien shows that inheritance carries both responsibility and opportunity, demanding reflection, ethical judgment, and strategic foresight. Legacy shapes leaders, communities, and civilizations, intertwining the past with the present and influencing the course of the future. By presenting these accounts incompletely, Tolkien highlights the active role individuals must play in interpreting, preserving, and shaping what is inherited. The unfinished nature of the tales invites readers to reflect on their own responsibilities, the continuity of history, and the enduring importance of ethical, courageous, and wise action in shaping both personal and collective legacy. Chapter 1. Oh, the rise and fall of How does greatness collapse under its own weight? In Unfinished Tales, the story of Númenor serves as a profound meditation on ambition, hubris, and moral responsibility. Chapter 10 examines the rise and fall of this legendary kingdom, illustrating how power, knowledge, and privilege, when misused or misunderstood, can precipitate catastrophic decline. Through fragmented narratives, Tolkien demonstrates that the fate of Númenor is not solely a tale of divine retribution, but also a reflection of human choice, ethical failure, and the delicate balance between wisdom and pride. The rise of Númenor is marked by achievement, knowledge, and courage. The Númenorians, descendants of the faithful among men, inherit a legacy of virtue, foresight, and divine favor. They excel in arts, governance, and exploration, creating a civilization of unprecedented prosperity and cultural richness. Yet, from the outset, Tolkien's fragments hint at the fragility of this success. The juxtaposition of achievement and impending doom illustrates a central theme. Greatness alone is insufficient to ensure moral integrity, humility, and ethical judgment are equally crucial. Leadership in Númenor reflects the tension between power and responsibility. Kings like Elros demonstrate foresight and virtue, guiding their people with wisdom and humility. Fragmented accounts reveal that effective governance in Númenor requires more than martial strength or political skill. It demands ethical discernment, attentiveness to counsel, and the capacity to balance Ambition with virtue. The fragments emphasize that leadership under conditions of abundance is particularly perilous. The very advantages that enable greatness, wealth, knowledge, and security can foster pride, entitlement, and eventual moral blindness. Númenor's moral decline illustrates the consequences of ignoring ethical boundaries. Over generations, arrogance grows, fueled by fear of mortality, desire for dominion, and resentment toward divine limitations. The fragments suggest that pride, unchecked ambition, and the lust for immortality erode the ethical foundation of the kingdom. Tolkien emphasizes that these internal failings, rather than solely external threats, precipitate the ultimate catastrophe. Númenor's fall exemplifies the delicate interplay between personal choice, collective behavior, and the unseen consequences of moral compromise. The narrative also examines the role of counsel and wisdom in shaping the kingdom's fate. Characters such as the faithful Númenorians and Gandalf, like a beast, though often operating in the shadows, represent the voices of reason, foresight, and moral clarity. Fragmented accounts suggest that when advice is ignored, misinterpreted, or resisted, even the most prosperous societies are vulnerable to collapse. The incomplete nature of these narratives mirrors the uncertainty and fragility inherent in governance. Knowledge and virtue require attentive engagement to prevent decline. Prophecy and forewarning play a pivotal role in Númenor's story. Warnings from divine messengers and the memory of ancestral faith serve as moral signposts, yet they are frequently disregarded or misunderstood. Tolkien's fragments highlight the complex interaction between foreknowledge, human choice, and ethical responsibility. While fate frames the broad trajectory of Númenor, the kingdom's collapse is precipitated by the choices of its rulers and citizens, illustrating that prophecy functions as a guide, not a deterministic mandate. The narrative's incompleteness invites reflection on the consequences of ethical inattention and the challenge of acting wisely under perceived inevitability. Social cohesion and collective responsibility are central to understanding Númenor's decline. Fragmented accounts reveal that the erosion of virtue is not confined to the ruling elite. It spreads through society, affecting norms, values, and shared moral frameworks. The decline of ethical standards, amplified by pride and fear, undermines trust, cooperation, and the capacity to respond effectively to challenges. Tolkien emphasizes that the health of a civilization depends not only on leadership, but also on the moral engagement and vigilance of its people. The fragments' incomplete nature reinforces the idea that societal collapse often results from the cumulative effect of individual and collective ethical failures. The spiritual dimension of Númenor's rise and fall is also significant. The kingdom's initial prosperity is intertwined with the guidance of the Valar and adherence to divine principles. Fragmented narratives depict the gradual departure from these ethical foundations, highlighting the dangers of neglecting spiritual responsibility. The pursuit of dominion, immortality, and autonomy beyond moral constraints ultimately alienates Númenor from its guiding principles. Tolkien's incomplete storytelling emphasizes the moral and spiritual consequences of ambition divorced from virtue, illustrating that material achievement alone cannot sustain a civilization. Númenor's unfold further explores the tension between human ambition and cosmic order. The fragments reveal a kingdom torn between the desire for independence and the ethical obligations inherited from ancestral guidance. Tolkien underscores that ethical and spiritual disregard, compounded by pride and impatience, destabilizes societies even when material resources and intellectual achievements are abundant. The unfinished nature of the narrative mirrors the uncertainty and complexity of human decisions, emphasizing the difficulty of maintaining moral integrity under pressure and temptation. The catastrophic fall of Númenor demonstrates the consequences of hubris on both personal and societal levels. Fragmented accounts recount how rebellion, corruption, and ethical erosion culminate in the kingdom's destruction, sending ripples across Middle. The narrative illustrates that moral compromise, when amplified through institutions, leadership, and culture, can have far-reaching consequences. Tolkien's incomplete approach reinforces the lesson that awareness, Ethical vigilance and humility are critical for the survival and flourishing of civilizations. The fragments also emphasize the redemptive potential of ethical leadership and foresight. Survivors who remain faithful to the valor and the moral principles of Númenor establish new kingdoms, including Arnor and Gondor, bringing lessons learned into future generations. The narrative highlights that legacy, moral engagement, and the cultivation of ethical principles can preserve knowledge, virtue, and social cohesion even after catastrophe. Tolkien's storytelling encourages readers to reflect on the dual nature of legacy. It encompasses both the dangers of neglecting ethical responsibility and the enduring impact of principled guidance. Finally, Númenor's story illustrates the interplay between individual choice, collective responsibility, and cosmic order. Fragmented narratives demonstrate that civilization is shaped not only by the structural and material conditions of society, but also by the ethical and moral choices of its leaders and citizens. Tolkien emphasizes that vigilance, humility, and adherence to guiding principles are essential for navigating both prosperity and adversity. The unfinished accounts invite reflection on the delicate balance required to sustain civilization, highlighting the consequences of ethical failure and the enduring importance of moral courage, foresight, and responsibility. In conclusion, Chapter 10 of Unfinished Tales examines the rise and fall of Númenor, emphasizing the complex interplay of power, morality, leadership, and ethical responsibility. The fragments illustrate that material prosperity and intellectual achievement are insufficient to ensure longevity without moral integrity and foresight. Through incomplete narratives, Tolkien emphasizes the fragility of civilization, the consequences of pride and hubris, and the enduring significance of ethical decisions. Númenor's story serves as both a warning and a guide. Greatness carries responsibility, prosperity demands vigilance, and the choices of leaders and citizens shape not only the present, but the future legacy of entire civilizations. By presenting these events in fragmentary form, Tolkien invites readers to reflect deeply on the moral, cultural, and spiritual dimensions of human ambition and the enduring challenge of sustaining virtue under the pressures of power and desire. Chapter 9. The Shadows of Angmar. What defines the line between visible and invisible threats? In Unfinished Tales, Tolkien explores the enduring menace of Angmar, a realm ruled by the Witch King, whose power shapes the fates of men, elves, and dwarves in ways often unseen but profoundly consequential. Chapter 9 examines the shadows cast by Angmar, illustrating how fear, strategy, and moral courage interact in the struggle against dark forces. Through fragmented accounts, Tolkien emphasizes that the most significant dangers are often psychological and strategic, operating through terror, manipulation, and subtle influence rather than open confrontation. Angmar's rise illustrates the destructive potential of fear and deception. The Witch King's influence extends far beyond his immediate armies, infiltrating politics, alliances, and communities. Fragmented accounts suggest that his power relies not only on martial strength, but also on the careful manipulation of perception. Leaders in the north, including the faithful Númenorians and the Elven kings, confront challenges that are not purely physical. The shadows of Angmar destabilize morale, erode trust, and force decisions under extreme uncertainty. Tolkien's choice to leave these accounts incomplete emphasizes the intangible and pervasive nature of such threats, highlighting the need for strategic insight, ethical judgment, and resilience in the face of ambiguity. The psychological dimension of Angmar's influence is central to understanding its power. Fear can distort perception, magnify errors, and erode cohesion among allies. The fragments reveal that leaders must contend with panic, suspicion, and despair while maintaining ethical guidance and strategic clarity. Gandalf's subtle interventions, often invisible to the wider world, counteract the Witch King's manipulations by reinforcing courage, moral judgment, and foresight. Tolkien's narrative strategy mirrors the hidden battles of the mind, showing that leadership requires not only tactical skill, but also the ability to manage fear and influence perception in ways that preserve integrity and unity. Political and military strategy in response to Angmar highlights the interplay between preparation and ethical responsibility. Leaders must balance immediate survival with long-term consequences, weighing alliances, resource allocation, and potential sacrifices. The fragmented nature of these accounts underscores that decisions often occur with incomplete information, forcing leaders to act under uncertainty while maintaining ethical standards. Elven and Númenorian guidance emphasizes that courage alone is insufficient. Effective resistance requires foresight, moral clarity, and a keen understanding of human and non-human nature. Tolkien's incomplete narratives encourage reflection on the complexity of ethical strategy under duress. The shadows of Angmar also underscore the theme of vigilance. Dark forces are rarely static, and threats often persist beyond the battlefield. The Witch King's influence is enduring precisely because it adapts, manipulates, and preys on weakness over time. The fragments suggest that vigilance is not passive, but active, requiring continuous assessment, strategic thinking, and ethical judgment. Leaders must anticipate potential dangers, foster cohesion, and maintain moral and psychological resilience. Tolkien's use of incomplete accounts mirrors the unpredictability of long-term threats, emphasizing that endurance, insight, and preparation are as essential as valor in confronting persistent evil. Another dimension is the role of collaboration and trust. Effective resistance against Angmar necessitates coordinated action between diverse groups: men, elves, dwarves, and wise counselors. The fragments illustrate that fear and uncertainty strain alliances, making communication, empathy, and moral leadership crucial. Gandalf's role exemplifies the importance of guiding collective efforts through counsel, foresight, and ethical influence. The narrative's fragmented style highlights the challenge of maintaining unity and purpose under pressure, reinforcing that leadership is not only about individual courage, but also about fostering collective resilience and moral clarity. Shadows also affect the individual moral landscape. The fragments reveal moments where leaders and heroes confront ethical dilemmas. Should they sacrifice few to save many? Should they act aggressively or patiently? These decisions, often complicated by fear and incomplete knowledge, underscore the moral weight of leadership. Tolkien presents the Witch King's influence as both a tangible and symbolic force, demonstrating that ethical decision-making under threat is an essential component of heroism. The unfinished narratives allow readers to reflect on the interplay between strategy, morality, and courage, emphasizing that ethical judgment is tested most profoundly in times of uncertainty and danger. Historical awareness further amplifies the burden of confronting knowledge of past conflicts, victories, and failures informs present choices. The fragmented accounts of battles, alliances, and resistance strategies illustrate that understanding history is essential for ethical and effective leadership. Leaders who ignore lessons from prior struggles risk repeating mistakes, while those who integrate knowledge with ethical foresight can influence outcomes positively. Tolkien's incomplete storytelling mirrors the partial and interpretive nature of historical understanding, emphasizing the complexity of leadership when confronting persistent and adaptive threats. The narrative also highlights the tension between visible and invisible influence. While armies and fortresses are tangible, fear, misinformation, and subtle manipulation often dictate outcomes before physical engagement occurs. Leaders must recognize these unseen factors and respond with both courage and strategic insight. Gandalf and other wise figures exemplify this balance, demonstrating that leadership involves anticipating consequences, guiding moral choices, and countering psychological manipulation. The fragments emphasize that the most effective resistance addresses both material and intangible threats, highlighting the multifaceted nature of leadership and courage. Angmar's shadows also underscore the importance of resilience. Threats that endure over time require sustained effort, adaptability, and moral consistency. Tolkien's fragmented approach illustrates that endurance is not only physical, but also ethical and psychological. Leaders and communities must maintain principles, preserve knowledge, and act strategically even when immediate outcomes are uncertain. This theme resonates across reinforcing that long-term success in the face of pervasive evil demands vigilance, foresight, and ethical fortitude. The fragments further illustrate that the battle against Angmar is as much about shaping perception as confronting physical danger. Maintaining hope, clarity, and ethical direction under threat is critical to preventing despair and disunity. Gandalf's guidance ensures that allies retain moral and strategic coherence, demonstrating that leadership under shadow requires subtlety, foresight, and unwavering commitment to ethical principles. Tolkien's choice to present these accounts incompletely allows readers to appreciate the nuanced and often invisible nature of effective leadership. Finally, Chapter 9 emphasizes the enduring relevance of ethical, strategic, and moral leadership in the face of pervasive danger. The Witch King's shadows are not easily overcome. They test courage, judgment, and collaboration through fragmented narratives. Tolkien shows that true heroism is not limited to battlefield exploits, but encompasses vigilance, foresight, moral discernment, and the cultivation of collective resilience. The Unfinished Tales encourage readers to consider the importance of strategy, ethical judgment, and moral courage in confronting both visible and invisible threats, highlighting that leadership extends far beyond immediate action to encompass guidance, foresight, and principled endurance. In conclusion, Chapter 9 of Unfinished Tales explores the shadows of Angmar, emphasizing the psychological, strategic, and moral dimensions of persistent threats. The fragmented accounts reveal that fear, manipulation, and uncertainty can influence outcomes as profoundly as open conflict. Tolkien presents leadership as a multifaceted exercise, requiring courage, ethical judgment, foresight, and collaboration. By leaving these narratives unfinished, Tolkien invites reflection on the complexity of decision-making under pressure, the importance of resilience, and the subtle ways in which moral and strategic guidance shapes history. The Shadows of Angmar remind readers that enduring threats demand both visible action and invisible strength, highlighting the profound interplay between strategy, ethics, and courage in shaping the fate of Middle-earth.